So we were all in the same reading group once upon a time. And one week we were doing readings on the Black Pacific. And one of the things that we read was the
Black
collection of articles. Actually, was that published? I don't even know who that was published by. Was it Amerasia?
It is what my
Okay, yeah, an Amerasia journal on the Black and Blue Pacific. And then at the very bottom of that was Teresia Teaiwa's article, which is incredible, and we will have that linked in the resources section. It's called Melanesian Histories, Micronesian Poetics. It does a really good job of situating Blackness within different contexts, both within the Pacific, where Teresia grew up in Fiji and then spent the second half of her life in Wellington in New Zealand, and then also reflects on her time in DC and California. And one part that spoke to all of us, and it speaks to everybody, I think, who reads it, is the part where she says, "Black is the color of solidarity." So we want to talk about that today. And to start us off, I think it would be nice to take a leaf from Teresia and also situate ourselves a little bit in place. And so we're going to start off by talking about where both of you grew up and what kind of education you had, who you were around, and how that has informed you. So do you want to start, Amanda?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I was born and raised on Ohlone land. So that's more commonly known as the Bay Area, California. I myself am Tongan and Italian and Irish and half white. And then I'm also in a transracial adoption where I'm been adopted into a family that's white and Asian American. And so that plays a part in my understanding of myself and in my understandings of Blackness. And I'll go further on that. So Ohlone land is very famous for being quite diverse and being very Black and informed by Black power and Black radicalism. Famously, the Black Panthers were founded in Oakland, which is about 45 minutes away from where I grew up. And my undergraduate, San Francisco State, is well known for having the first College of Ethnic Studies, which in large part was created because of the Black Student Union there, and then in coalition with the Third World Liberation Front, which was a multi-ethnic, very diverse coalition. But in all of this, and from my adoption, I was actually raised in an incredibly white and affluent region of the Bay Area, like a pocket. And I had all the trappings of a classic and deeply problematic and very anti-Black US education, a very anti-Indigenous US education. And it wasn't until my higher education days and my undergraduate, my graduate, that I started to engage more deeply in unpacking Blackness and uprooting anti-Blackness in myself and in my community.
I just want to say first, thank you, Trish, for inviting Amanda and I to be part of this conversation. Where did I grow up? Okay, so I grew up in Toronto, or more commonly known as Toronto, which is the unceded territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, and what we now know is so-called Canada. And I felt like I spent a lot of my early life, thinking about how Blackness functions very differently in that context. So in comparison to the continental United States, particularly in Toronto, we have a really large Black population that comes from the Caribbean. So the relationship already to the Caribbean diaspora asks us to think about different questions about Black experience in comparison to the US. And then in addition to that, the place where I grew up in Toronto, which is kind of on the borderlands of Scarborough and Markham, for those of you who are familiar with the Toronto context, was a place where we had a lot of folks, Asian folks who came also from the Caribbean as a result of the history of indentured servitude. So I felt like a lot of the conversations we were already having in a Toronto context were very different than the US and deeply informed by how Black folks and Asian folks were negotiating Blackness within the Caribbean. In addition to that, like in my own high school, maybe somewhat differently than a lot of other people who grew up in Canada, I actually grew up around a lot of Black educators and POC educators. So in high school, this is also in the context of Obama, we were reading stuff like Maya Angelou, Dion Brand, Toni Morrison, and really thinking about Black experience and thinking about race in the context of this emerging election south of the border. At the same time, growing up within my high school where there were a lot of Black students, as well as Filipino students who have a particular relationship with the police where they're really trying to unpack racial biases that are targeted to our communities. I felt like the kinds of conversations that we were having were deeply embodied about what it means to live in these racialized bodies in this context at this moment in time. And a lot of that really continues to inform the way that I think about Black scholarship and my relationship to Black scholarship as a Filipino, as a queer Filipino diaspora person who grew up in Toronto.
And we all met at the University of Hawaii, at Manoa, all doing our graduate school education in the summer of, no, sorry, I'm just kidding. sorry. Anyway, yeah, we all met at UH, all in different departments. But yeah, we met there. And so I wanted us to also reflect on the importance of Hawaii within our own genealogy of understanding Blackness. And maybe to reflect a little bit on how that experience helped to shape or problematize your understanding of Blackness or anti-Blackness.
For me, growing up in Toronto where there were a lot of Black folks and also being around people who were organizing around Black issues in regards to the police, and then coming to Hawaii was really mind-boggling for a couple of reasons. So one, that when I came to UH, I felt like people really weren't having a conversation about anti-Blackness and Blackness, period. Maybe there were definitely pockets, and I can definitely talk about that later on. There were pockets of people who were engaged in questions about how Blackness functions in this context. But generally speaking, locating Blackness and anti-Blackness, it was doesn't exist, period, don't have the language, which was very perplexing as someone who grew up in Toronto. And then later on, really through a lot of the relationships that I started to build via just organizing and being at UH with a lot of folks, particularly within CPIS and the Pacific Island Studies program. Shout out to Joy and Emoto. They really helped me to think about what Blackness looks like in a Pacific context, and to not just get so caught up with the conversation around anti-Blackness, but really reflecting on Blackness as generative, Blackness as linked to genealogy, Blackness as related to indigeneity. And I felt like I didn't have that kind of language prior to coming to UH, and it really pushed me to think differently about how I was approaching a lot of the conversations, and also how I was approaching what was going on at the time in Black Lives Matter on the continent.
Yeah, totally. And I had the same, I had a very similar experience with UH, where I had a difficult time locating Black voices, Black stories, Black radicalism. I'd see glimpses of it, and I saw how it was impacting the type of activism that goes on at UH, but it wasn't as prominent as, of course, and on Ohlone Land and the Bay Area. And, as I mentioned previously, my earlier years of education was really rooted in traditional, deeply colonial, anti-Black teachings. Like we read To Kill a Mockingbird. I had to read it multiple times, and that was like the only ways that we were talking about Blackness. I also had to read Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is incredibly, like, it's all founded on environmental determinism and incredibly violent. And then coming to my undergraduate at a community college in California, and then to San Francisco State, I suddenly became much more engaged, not only with Black scholarship and radicalism, but many more different types of different genealogies of intellect and thinking and organizing, and also with myself as a woman of color, because I was pretty lost. I was getting out of the sunken place, but I had to climb. But then, when I moved to Hawaii, not only was the activism different, I'm not saying it wasn't there, it was just very different to what I experienced in the Bay Area. Hawaii, activism in Hawaii is much more like based on who you know, and like getting to know those people, and then like building spaces together. Whereas in the Bay Area, that is happening, but if something happens immediately, it's kind of like, oh, do you need a sign? I got 5 signs, you come with us and we'll do this together. It's very loud and very active, and it's informed by Black radicalism. And even beyond the organizing realm, I think in my day-to-day experiences, like I thought I had a good understanding of how much Black culture informs the Bay Area experience, and of course also Mexican and Latinx culture informs the Bay Area experience. But when I came to Hawaii, it was like, oh my goodness, there were so many things that were different, and there were so many things that made me, one, miss home, like deeply, and 2, really question how much appropriation goes on at home of Black culture and Latinx culture. A good example, if I have time for AAVE, as when I came to Hawaii, of course, there's Pidgin and different colloquialisms and slang here, which are lovely, Raja. But in the Bay Area, because of the creativity of African American vernacular, and the art and reclaiming of a language that has been so violent and oppressive towards Black folks, there is constantly new language coming out of Black communities, or at least there's language that's been in Black communities for a long time who other communities then are exposed to and start using. So you hear different new words for different contexts pretty much every week, if not every month or couple months. And then suddenly being in Hawaii, I really missed that frequent development of colloquialism or ways of relating to language and one another through speech. And yeah, I really had to learn that was from like how much my life was impacted and informed by Black culture, even more than I thought I already knew.
Yes, sorry, I'm just reorienting my screen. Yeah, that's really important. And the other thing that's really significant about you both is that not only have we all been on journeys of trying to articulate and understand Blackness in a more meaningful way, but also you two are both teaching at the moment. And so I'd love to hear about how this like process of unlearning certain things has also translated into the way that you have been teaching your students about Blackness, especially given the two quite different contexts in which you're both teaching within.
Yeah, I was really interested in coming into conversation with each of you, I guess in a more formal way, about the way Black Lives Matter has impacted our own understandings of Blackness, but also our teaching, our understandings of teaching, our pedagogy, our plans for it, as we're all baby academics whose long-term dreams and goals are to be professors or at least educators at some level. When this latest wave of Black Lives Matter arose in late May, June of 2020, I was very, very shaken, as many were, as we all were, right? And I just couldn't get out of my head that if every single person was as anti-racist or not racist as they claim to be, then we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be experiencing this over and over and over again. And in that thought, you have to think, well, I'm part of everyone. I'm part of everyone. That means I'm not doing my job. And I'm a very junior teacher. I teach at a community college. I teach Intro to Pacific Island Studies at a community college in California. I'm currently in the middle of my second quarter teaching, and last winter was my first quarter teaching, and then I was a TA before them. But I'm just like really baby steps. And I had already been in the process of doing a better job teaching and deconstructing colonialism and colonial thinking, and discussing indigeneity through my pedagogy. But the BLM really smacked me in my face and was like, you're not doing that right if you're not talking about Blackness more in depth and anti-Blackness and uprooting that, because not including that conversation in Pacific Island studies is contributing to colorism and anti-Blackness in my community and in the discipline that I teach in. And if me with my little person and myself have a classroom of 50 students, because they overwork me and underpay me, I'm not doing my part to educate folks, then I need to get out of here. I'm not doing it right. Do you want me to talk about what I'm doing, or is the sound better for Kat? And do you want to talk about what your feelings were?
Yeah, I can talk. So I teach a class in American Studies called American Empire and Emergent Feminist Strategies. And that class, I put in my course description, is really centered in the context or in the lens of place, and thinking about what it means to think about American empire in the context of being in occupied Hawaii, but also thinking about all these other kinds of issues, right? Like anti-Blackness and the Black Lives Matter movement within the context of being in this place where you have all these different kinds of racial geographies operating very different than on the continent. So when I was approaching my class and thinking about how am I going to teach about Black Lives Matter and anti-Blackness, I actually teach a unit. It's called Black Feminisms, Black Lives Matter, and Say Her Name. And I thought about how being located in Hawaii in an occupied space, we have to think about two different kinds of geographies. So on the one hand, as people living in a colony of the US, also a legal state of the United States, we have to think about the ways in which anti-Blackness and Blackness function within the context of the continental US. So in my class, we're really, we just actually finished the unit. We think through the conversation about the history of chattel slavery, the implication of the afterlife of chattel slavery. We talk about the history of the prison industrial complex, policing in the United States, and we reference to how that relates to the current institutions that exist here in Hawaii. At the same time, focusing on place, right? And focusing on Hawaii asks us to think about broader questions about Hawaii's relationship to the Pacific. So at the end of that unit, we kind of talk about how Hawaii is like duly interpolated by these two different geographies. And we have conversations about how anti-Blackness functions in the Pacific, right? So where does that anti-Blackness function? Who is considered as Black? How does it relate to indigeneity in the Pacific? And we use Joy Enomoto's article as an entry point. That's the Why Black Lives Matter in the Hawaiian Kingdom. We read Joyce Puolani Warren's dissertation on Po. We read Teresia Teaiwa, as well as all the other folks who are in that awesome forum on Black and Blue Pacific, the Amerasia Forum, and we also read other stuff on West Papua. And we use that as a way to talk about how in the Pacific, anti-Blackness is connected to all of these longer histories of colonial infrastructure, right? How colonialism, whether it is American or British or German or whatever the heck it is, right? All of these different geographies are interpreting the way that people are being racialized as Black in the Pacific. But we also turn towards people like Pualani as well as Joy to talk about Blackness as generative. And I think we have some really, really interesting conversations when we start from that point, both connecting Blackness to indigeneity, but also thinking, again, for kind of connecting this to what Teresia was saying about Blackness as a site of resistance. That my students actually did this really beautiful poem last week about how, because Blackness is connected to indigeneity, land struggles are connected to that land struggles are part of Black Lives Matter. And that we need to make those kinds of connections on Indigenous sovereignty in order to think about how decolonization in the Pacific can also inform our decolonization here in Hawaii.
Right, totally. And that was what I needed to work on for myself to get myself to the point of how do I bring this conversation more squarely into Pacific Island studies, because I do, this will be for pretty much all of my students. I think I've had one student who transferred from a different community college. This is the first time they're ever learning about the Pacific in a classroom at all. And for those folks who are in my classroom, they're really yearning to see themselves like somewhere, because in the invisibility on Turtle Island racial politics for Pacific Islanders is incredibly crushing. So I guess in some ways, that's another layer that I have to contend with how do I bring this into conversation in my class? How do I make it a central conversation in my class? And through this questioning of myself and the discipline, I actually had to realize how Americentric my understanding of Blackness actually was. I really needed to work on myself, right? Because there's different levels of knowing. There's like, I kind of get it. I move through, I can kind of make the right decision most of the time. I can talk to my friends, close people about it. And then there's the level of knowing that you need to know in order to teach effectively and to teach strangers. And I had to get real with myself and see that I actually didn't have a strong enough understanding of Blackness in order to do that effectively in my discipline and in my own classroom. And that's where the reading group, like Black and Blue Pacific, and then also Black Shoals by Tiffany King, and then the Chelsea Bond article that that you and Maeve sent me, and then we also read in the reading group, Trish and Kat, where I had to unlock in my mind and understand that Black people are Indigenous people. And that is the norm. It is the norm. Black people are Indigenous people. In the US, Black people are Indigenous people who were stolen and brought to stolen land. And that's what is unique about, you know, the particular conversation that I've been embedded in for most of my life. But that does not, because before I was having a hard time understanding Blackness in an Aboriginal Australian context. But once I linked those together and understood that, then being able to teach about Blackness in a Pacific context really flowered and blossomed and became incredible and much easier to understand and much easier to communicate. Because when we did our lessons on settler colonialism and militarism and we learned about the ideas behind colonial projects, then it became really easy to figure out point to where that anti-Blackness came from and point to where the anti-indigeneity came from. And that is the mechanisms and the tools and the power that colonizers used in order to displace Indigenous peoples and enslave them. So we do it through multiple classes. We watch some little basic things because it's a very entry-level course about what is race and what is ethnicity, and we do a whole unit on colorism. We read Tarcisius Kabutalaka's Ignoble Savages, which calls out colorism in Pacific Islander spaces, particularly calls out us Polynesians being hella anti-Black and problematic. Please get it together. No, it's true. He does talk about it. And then it's also a good article because he proposes this idea of the ignoble savage. So in a teaching context, particularly in Turtle Island, you can talk about the trope of the noble savage and then in relationship to anti-Blackness, because they're all from the same place. So yeah, I want to talk about the class that Trish and I taught in, but I want to open it up to Kat before I go on forever.
No, totally. Go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay. And then on top of the colorism, it's a theme that travels through the class when we talk about militarization. We read a lot of Teresia, and you can't read Teresia without knowing that she is a Black woman, but also understanding the Black radical philosophies that inform her work and make it so incredible. And then just this last week, I had the lovely pleasure of having our facilitator, the great Patricia Tupou, come to my classroom, and we did a lecture on diaspora that I'm really happy with, because we did a lecture on diaspora about Pacific migrations and then Pacific diaspora communities globally, and then we did a focus on the US and Aotearoa New Zealand. And then we did the mobility of ideas and empowerment through the Black Power movement, which informed the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific, as well as the Polynesian Panthers. And I think the reason why I'm getting so excited about that lecture and why I'm so happy with it is because it really gets at the Teresia quote that we started it with, right? Like, Black is the color of solidarity.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we will all write something together with Maeve Powell, who we've like briefly mentioned, who is an Indigenous scholar here in Australia. But I just wanted to say as well, like jumping off of what Amanda was just saying about the diaspora class we just had last week, is that like, yeah, when Teresia is writing Black is the Color of Solidarity, she's writing that from Wellington. And I think that's really significant because as we've just like mentioned, like the history of ideas, the mobility of ideas is super significant in the Pacific in terms of Black power, because that is the legacy of just like one thing, one part of it. There's multiple legacies, right? But that's just one part, is the creation of the Polynesian Panthers and then the incredible work that they did, which I don't know why I'm getting emotional. That's so annoying.
Oh, because it's part of your family's story.
Yeah.
I wanted to cry too.
Yeah, but that's why that will be a written piece. Because it's too much to talk about. But yeah, especially like for me, I think like Teresia's article is really important, but especially with the most recent momentum behind BLM and being in Australia when that was happening, really made me think about like just how grateful I am to that legacy, because they don't have that in Australia in terms of the Pacific community here. And that is integral to the way that Pacific Islanders are able to organize in New Zealand and be really safe and heard, and also have such high visibility, which you just like, I just am so grateful for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're going to wrap up because we've been talking for half an hour. But I just wanted to say thank you to you both for being a part of this conversation, and also for the incredible work that you're both doing in your classrooms and outside of the classroom. It's really important to have friends that are smart, but also like take such good care and have like a lot of thoughtfulness behind the things that they're doing and just the way that they're living their lives. So I really appreciate you both for that, and for also being so generous with your time and having this conversation the second time round. This is our second recording. So thank you so much for giving up part of your Sunday to talk. I really appreciate it. And any last thoughts, or happy to wrap up there? Oh, you're on mute.
I apologize. I just wanted to say thank you again for creating spaces like this for us to continue this conversation. I feel like every time we have moments we're able to gather and share space, we're not just reflecting, we're creating and producing new knowledge. And that knowledge is really important to think about our teaching, but also our collective liberation.
Totally.
Thank you both as well. I learn so much from you all the time. And I feel particularly grateful for your friendships as somebody who's like born and raised under like a very powerful, like very intense empire. And if I didn't have friends who were born and raised outside of it, I don't know if I would be, I don't know how long it would have taken me to get to some of the conclusions that I've gotten to once I have become your friend. And that means that's added, in the short time that I've known you all, it's added a tremendous amount of value, not only to my scholarship, but to how I move throughout my daily life. And I'm deeply grateful.
Thank you.